Well, good morning, everybody. Thanks so much for joining this webinar. This is Properly Managing and Invoicing a NASA Contract, and it is the 8th in our series of webinars from the Alabama A&M University RISE Foundation, developed as part of a cooperative agreement with NASA in an effort to give minority-serving institutions a competitive advantage in federal contracting opportunities. Before we begin, we do have a message from Mr. Clarence Bostic, who will explain the purpose of this webinar series.
Hello, my name is Clarence Bostic. I'm the MUREP Education Specialist and Music Activity Manager at NASA's Langley Research Center. MUREP is the Minority University Research and Education Program and is part of the Office of STEM Engagement for NASA. Music is one of its many projects. But what is music? Music stands for MUREP for Sustainability and Innovation Collaborative. It's a cooperative agreement for teams of minority-serving institutions, also called MSIs, and nonprofit institutions to create and provide workshops and training materials establishing sustainable support for MSIs that desire to develop their institution's capacity through the competition for federal funds. Why is music important? The expectation is that the awardees will train MSIs to develop their institutional capacity, better enabling them to compete for federal funding opportunities. These endeavors then result in successful application to and management of new funding opportunities, including those at NASA. The agreement extends MSI's capabilities by leveraging the MSI's research with NASA research to develop small business innovation research and small business technology transfer projects. Together, these partnerships develop and demonstrate innovative technologies that fulfill NASA's needs and have significant potential for successful commercialization. The music agreement also increases the preparation of science, technology, engineering, and mathematics faculty with opportunities to participate with NASA researchers and agency missions through grants and contracts. So what does music mean to you? By participating, we want you to apply for more NASA contracts, SBIR and STTR projects, as well as other federal funds. MSIs are given additional strategies to manage their federal funding opportunities. So what do you need to do now? Take full advantage of this opportunity. Learn about NASA's resources. Participate in the process. Collaborate with other participants. Prepare your institution's capability statement. And finally, sign up for the NASA Office of Small Business Programs vendor database. Ultimately, the goal of any proposed activity or combination of activities should enable faculty and associated staff of sponsored research programs to learn to compete for and effectively manage contracts primarily, as well as grants or other federal funding sources. Thank you.
Okay, so I would like to begin by introducing myself. I am Sharon Brooks Hodge. I'm the Vice President and Chief Operating Officer at Phenomenal Management Partners, and we're a consulting firm that was hired to manage this webinar series for the Alabama A&M University RISE Foundation. And RISE is the acronym for Research, Innovation, Science, and Engineering. And PMP is supporting the RISE Foundation in this cooperative agreement with NASA. So here's what we're going to be discussing in today's webinar. We're going to have an overview of a contract's life cycle, the contract's governing authority, reviewing your contract. We're going to discuss why you must set up charge codes, what does it mean to begin work, monitoring your performance, contract risk type, invoicing, contract closeout, and I'll conclude with providing some additional resources. As your phones have been muted to prevent any feedback during the presentation, but if you have questions, please type them in the chat box and I will answer the questions during the designated question and answer period at the end. So this illustration gives you a snapshot of the process flow over the life cycle of your contract. The cycle begins once you receive an award. After you have reviewed the contract and its terms and conditions with your team, your administrator and finance personnel should set up charge codes, then assign codes to all personnel who will be working on the contract. I'm going to be saying this several times over the course of this webinar, but it's important and imperative that you do this before any work begins. Again, you need to set up your charge code before any work begins. Then you will begin working on the deliverables, which are based on the scope of work. You're going to monitor performance of the work, and you're going to invoice NASA for payment. So depending on the terms of your contract, you may be repeating these last three steps, the work, monitor, and invoice. You might be repeating those steps monthly, quarterly, or annually before reaching the end of the contract. And that's when you would close it out. So this is a contract life cycle. If you are working on something with NASA under a cooperative agreement or a grant, the process is likely to be different, and it will be based on the governing authority of the funding vehicle. So the funding vehicle for contracts is governed by the FAR, the Federal Acquisition Regulation. And we have discussed the FAR in previous webinars, and we have also recommended that you or a member of your administrative team become familiar with the FAR. I hope that you have taken the time to do that. If not, you should at least know where to find it and how to browse topics that may be applicable to your contract. And so you will be receiving an email that will have this slide presentation in it. And I've provided the link to the URL for the FAR on this slide. So my recommendation to you is once you get it, to take this, click on the link, and become familiar with the FAR. As we have advised you in previous webinars, and again just a couple of slides ago, one of the first things that you should do after receiving an award is to hold a contract review meeting with everyone who will be working on the contract. This includes your administrative and financial people, as well as the technical team members. The primary objective of the review of the contract is to help all personnel involved develop compliant deliverables on time, on schedule, and within the budget. You will need to create a process for generating and sending invoices and that process must make sure that your invoices are accurate and compliant with federal regulations, and you're going to need to ensure that all personnel and subcontractors are paid on time. So your contract has three elements. Part 1 contains the schedule, which is the description of services and how to administer the contract. Part 2 contains the FAR clauses. It's going to state the part and subpart rather than a narrative. So it's up to you or your contract manager to know specifically what is stated in the FAR part and subpart clauses. Remember, this is a legally binding document, so you need to know what you have agreed to do. Part 3 contains the list of documents, exhibits, and other attachments related to the contract deliverables and other specifications. Understanding your contract is essential to monitoring performance and ensuring that all conditions have been fulfilled by the end when it's time to close the contract out. So let's talk about charge codes. Why are they important? Well, in order to successfully invoice for payment, every person working on the contract must be assigned a code. This will ensure that the university has the appropriate personnel working on the contract in accordance with the proposal that was submitted to win the award. The specific code that you create will be determined by your administrative and financial team members and likely will be influenced by the accounting or financial management software program that you have selected to use. What matters most is that failure to invoice the appropriate personnel as proposed on the contract could result in significant consequences, such as penalties on invoices or even termination of your contract. So again, make sure you set the charge codes up before any work actually begins on the contract. So let me be a little more specific here about the charge codes. The code assigned to each person should reflect his or her labor category and rate. So an example would be that an engineering technician is going to have a different charge code than perhaps your highest level of subject matter expert. So if you've attended our webinar on pricing, we will explain how to set up your labor codes and rates, but there should be a description of a person's job title and duties and functions, and then there's a labor code associated with that particular job, and your charge codes will indicate when that person is working and what they're doing on the project, and that should correlate to what you have proposed. So if you've said that you're going to have somebody with a master's degree working on something, you need to make sure that your invoicing or that your charge codes are showing that the person who is doing that work has the level of education and experience that you proposed. Again, all of that is contained in your charge codes, and that's why they must be set up to be able to record who is doing what on your contract. Hopefully, now you can see why it is important to set the charge codes up, as well as the invoicing system, your process and procedures before any work is actually done. Contracting with the government imposes requirements that are not ordinarily found in the commercial market or typically in your university system. Government contractors must adhere to additional regulations and procedures. Federal timekeeping policies are contained, guess where? The FAR, the Federal Acquisition Regulations, as well as the Defense Contract Audit Agency requirements. So I'm going to say it one more time. Let me encourage you to read the FAR, or at least the regulations that pertain to timekeeping requirements. They touch on manual and electronic systems of tracking labor use on your government contract. Keep in mind that labor is the single largest cost driver and has a direct impact on the total cost of your government contract project. Now we're going to talk about monitoring your performance, and that is directly related to the terms and conditions of the contract. Again, that's why you review your contract with your entire team and that you understand the parts of the contract so that you know what it is that you are monitoring. Most specifically, the scope of work. Your contract manager should be reviewing the workflow process to ensure that deliverables are being submitted on time and meet the specifications that you promised. Have there been any mandatory meetings? Did the appropriate people attend those meetings and disseminate any information that may result in changes in procedures that impact the rest of the contract? What about the cash flow to keep the project on schedule? When the university believes it is about to run out of funds, a 60-day notification must be submitted to the contracting officer stating that you're running low on funds. So if you are not properly monitoring your contract, you might not notice until you are 45 or 30 days from running out of money. Again, this is why you review the contract and set up your policies and management procedures before the work actually begins. However, if you neglected to do that, you can identify any procedural errors and make modifications during the monitoring process. In addition to monitoring your scope of work, your monitoring should also include oversight of three more things: manual timekeeping, electronic systems, and written policies. So let's talk a little bit more about each of them. First, manual timekeeping. So even though there's an increased use in electronic systems, the federal government's criteria for timekeeping are still based largely on manual practices. You need to know that supervisors and administrators cannot complete the timesheets on any employee's behalf unless there are legitimate grounds for doing so, like perhaps the employee is sick or is traveling on the project at the time that your time must be submitted. The employee is responsible for ensuring that his or her timesheet is filled out accurately and has the appropriate charge code. The supervisor then must countersign and approve the information before the document can be submitted for payment. Electronic systems. You need to be prepared to demonstrate adequate internal control policies, particularly when using electronic timekeeping systems. Employees should access their timesheets using secure password protections and maintain personal control of their timesheets so that no unapproved changes can be made. They then are required to make daily entries of all the hours that they have worked, and they cannot make entries or charge for labor in advance of working. During an audit process, the government will usually want to inspect the system logs to verify that the persons accessing the system, who they are, and the reasons why they have accessed the system. And if any errors have been made, the audit will seek to determine how they were resolved. Written policies. Government contracts and the contractors are required to have comprehensive written timekeeping policies, and that they're going to demonstrate in those policies that your university has practices and is in compliance with the federal government requirements. The university must have written policies relating to the preparation of timesheets and document how employees are trained or have been trained to use the timesheets and apply time codes or the charge codes. The university must have written policies relating to time code charges. And of course, the charge codes are the codes that each person uses to designate the time that is going to be billed on the contract. And that is the basis for calculating the total labor on the contract. The university should be in a position to produce evidence of periodic audits or spot checks to monitor compliance with timekeeping requirements. So the purpose of monitoring your contract is to ensure that you are compliant with the terms and conditions of the contract, but it also serves to minimize risk. That's risk to you and your university, as well as risk to the government. So who is most at risk? Well, that really depends on what type of contract you have. As this chart demonstrates, contracts that expose the university to the most risk are on the left, while the government's exposure to risk increases as the contract types move to the right. So in monitoring, you want to be aware of potential risk to your institution, but also be aware that NASA or whatever government agency you're contracting with is going to be monitoring to minimize their own exposure to risk. And what does that mean? Well, let's think about the highest risk to your university. That would be a firm fixed price contract. So quoted $100,000 for the project. But at the end of the first quarter, your labor expenses have exceeded $40,000. You are not going to be able to bill NASA for more than the firm fixed price that you quoted, but you are still obligated to deliver on your scope of work. Closer monitoring of the contract may have prevented you from going over budget, but now you must adjust your labor expense in order to keep from losing money. Similarly, monitoring of a cost plus percentage of cost contract or a cost reimbursable contract will seek to minimize inefficiencies that would require NASA or whatever government agency you're working with to spend more than it would have to spend on a more efficiently managed contract. Let's talk for a moment about invoicing. Of course, the invoices will be generated based on the charges applied to the contract. On a cost reimbursable contract, the university is obligated to provide best efforts in accordance with the statement of work, and you're going to invoice in accordance with the cost incurred that are allowable and allocable. If it is a firm fixed price contract, you will deliver the goods or services and invoice either at the end of the contract or upon completion of milestones. In this case, the hours worked on the contract are irrelevant for invoicing because you have agreed to a firm fixed price. You still need to know the cost effectiveness, so whether or not you are actually making money on the contract, but in terms of invoicing, you'll only be invoicing what it is that you propose because it's firm fixed price. On time and material contracts, you must show the number of hours that personnel worked on the contract as well as their labor category and their rate of pay. And I explained that to you a few slides before. All work must be in accordance with the scope of work. So after you have completed all work, delivered the product or service, and invoiced the agency, the final element in a contract's life cycle is the closeout. And a closeout occurs when a contract has met all the terms of the contract and all the administrative actions have been completed, all disputes have been settled, and final payment has been made. And there is a specific procedure for contract closeout. And where can you find it? You can find it in the FAR. The Federal Acquisition Regulation 4.804-5 contains the procedures for contract closeout. We have provided a checklist here that will guide you through the process, and we do recommend that you come back for our webinar that will address contract closeouts. So if you would like more guidance on becoming contract ready, I recommend that you visit our web portal, the Knowledge Sharing Center, which is located at www.theknowledgesharingcenter.com. And the site contains our previous webinars, as well as training modules that you can download, including such topics as the difference between contracts and grants, Contracting 101, acquisition planning, marketing your university's capabilities, responding to solicitations, and effective contract negotiations. Also available on the Knowledge Sharing Center is our workbook, Doing Business with the Government. And this workbook is designed to provide a general overview of key aspects of government contracting, and you'll find a 90-day action plan that includes a list of next step actions to help you implement everything that you have learned. So now I will take any questions that you have regarding the proper management and invoicing of a NASA contract. If you have questions, you can submit them in the chat box. I'll give you a couple of minutes here to submit. And actually, let me go ahead and turn on your microphones there. You can raise your hand if anybody has a specific question. You can go ahead and speak to me now. Are there any questions? If you think of something when you replay the webinar or after you receive the slides, this is my email address, vp@wearepmp.com, and you can send me your questions and I will respond as quickly as I can. One more call for questions. Anybody have any questions? Well, I appreciate your participation and I hope that this information is helpful to you when you receive a contract, and it gives you the guidance for properly managing and invoicing. Thanks so much, and that concludes today's webinar.